Hi, hello and welcome back to my channel. Thank you so much for clicking on this video. I hope you enjoy. Today we will be covering the case of Robert and Nancy Kissel, and this case takes us to Hong Kong. Robert Kissel met Nancy Kissel at a singles resort in the Caribbean in 1987. After talking, they discovered that they had both lived in New York and they started dating. Robert came from a wealthy family in New Jersey. He had a brother and a sister, Andrew and Jane. Nancy was born and raised in Michigan, and her parents had divorced when she was still young. Nancy had a younger half-brother named Brooks. Nancy immediately knew that she would one day marry Robert, and the two of them moved in together rather quickly and were married in 1989 after living together for 2 years. While Robert attended New York University full-time pursuing his master's degree in finance, Nancy worked 3 jobs in the catering industry, as well as at a cab company in Manhattan to support them. Nancy had a bachelor's degree in business and a master's in design and was very artistic. However, she felt that Robert was more driven than she was, and she had decided to sidetrack her own career goals to help her husband further his ambitions. After graduating from NYU in 1991, Robert took a job with Lazard Frères in New York, where he worked for 5 years. He then moved on to the Goldman Sachs Group and was offered a vice presidency in the Hong Kong office in 1997. By this time, Robert and Nancy had a daughter, and they decided that Robert would take the job and the family would make the move to Hong Kong. This was a big adventure for the family. The Kissels lived in the Hong Kong expat community of the upmarket Parkview Private Estate, which cost them around $20,000 per month in 1997. The people that lived there were highly paid husbands that were on call to their companies 24/7, and their wives, who would be left alone in a foreign country, left to bond with each other. There they would also strive to maintain luxurious lifestyles and always try and be better and have more than the other wives. The children of these families attended the upclass Hong Kong International School. Hong Kong's ethnic Chinese refer to these women of leisure as Tai Tai, meaning the spoiled rich man's wife. Nancy and Robert had suffered from marital issues before they had moved to Hong Kong, but it took a turn for the worse once they had moved there. She said that Robert started using drugs, especially coke, while he was attending graduate school in New York, but it wasn't until they settled in Hong Kong that it became a problem. She said he always wanted relief from the grueling pressures of his job, and he started using more and more of this, and he would also drink more and more alcohol. His alcoholic drink of choice was, of course, single malt scotch, the rich man's drink. She said that when he drank and got high, he became abusive, and this also led to him forcing himself on her when she refused to have sex with him. She said that after the birth of their first child, she had gained weight and her husband didn't find her as attractive as he once had, and he continuously told her that she needed to lose weight. She said that after this, they started doing the deed in ways where he would not look at her face. She said that while in Hong Kong in 1998, when she was pregnant with their 3rd child, a son, her husband had learned that her due date would interfere with a planned business trip that he had to Korea, which is when he flew into a rage, demanding that she see her doctor about having an induction done. She refused, and during their quarrel, he threw a punch at her. She ducked just in time, causing him to put his fist through a wall, cracking a bone in his hand. Months later, they fought over the same issue, and he went in to punch her again. And this time, he did not miss. Although Nancy and Robert's marriage had not been a happy one, Robert's job meant that they could afford a nanny and housekeepers, which meant that Nancy found herself with an abundance of spare time. To keep herself occupied, she played tennis, because the place that they stayed had tennis courts, and she also started her own photography business. To the outside world, she was a model mother of 3 young children who volunteered a great deal of her time at the Hong Kong International School and at their synagogue, all the while maintaining her business. The outside world had no idea what had been happening in her personal life, according to Nancy. In the year 2000, Robert was hired by Merrill Lynch in Hong Kong, where he was made Managing Director of Global Investments. In his position, he earned roughly around $3 million a year in bonuses alone. Nancy said at a certain point after this, Robert had become more and more controlling of her spending, keeping tabs on what she spent the money on, and at one point even taking back 4 of the 5 credit cards that she had. She said that behind closed doors, she lived in dread of her husband and his volatile moods, which would lead him to either hit her or sexually violate her. She claimed that she was able to maintain the appearances of a perfect corporate wife while living in her own private hell. She was willing to endure it, figuring that this was the lot of the tai-tai. But in March 2003, an unexpected event in Hong Kong sent her to the other side of the globe. Of Hong Kong's 6.9 million residents in 2003, around 30,000 at the time were American expats. In the winter of 2003, the Americans started leaving Hong Kong in huge numbers. The Starbucks coffee shops, McDonald's fast food restaurants, and other businesses favored by the Americans started losing business by the day. The reason for these hasty exits was the SARS epidemic that had struck the city of Hong Kong. The American wives and their children fled back to the United States, fearing for their health and safety. But the workaholic, corporate ladder climbing husbands and fathers stayed behind to focus on their jobs. It was decided that Nancy would take their 3 children to the family's vacation home near Stratton Mountain, Vermont, where they would stay until they could return to Hong Kong. The epidemic in Hong Kong worsened, and there was no telling when it would be safe for these expat families to return. While they were in America, Nancy purchased an expensive home theater system, figuring that she and the kids would be staying there for an unknown period of time, and that they would need something to entertain themselves with. The man who sold the equipment to Nancy sent his brother, Michael Del Priore, to install it. Nancy was drawn to Michael pretty much as soon as he walked into the house. She thought that he was ruggedly handsome. While he was there, they hit it off and had a great conversation, and they got to know one another, with Michael hanging on to Nancy's every word, and vice versa. This meeting led to them becoming close friends. Michael had twice been divorced and lived in a nearby trailer park. Nancy and Michael often spoke on the phone to each other for long periods of time. One day he confided to her that his alcoholic father used to beat his mother. He stated that he wanted to reveal this to her because he had noticed that she often had the same downtrodden look on her face that his mother usually wore. She found a shoulder to cry on in Michael. He listened to her. They talked at length, with Nancy pouring out her troubles to him. For the first time in years, Nancy felt seen and heard, and their friendship soon became a love affair. During this time, she bought Michael some expensive gifts as well. One of them was a $5,000 wristwatch. In July 2003, he took her to a tattoo parlor. Robert had allegedly forbade Nancy from getting a tattoo, which is something that she had always wanted, but he had never allowed. There, she had her children's names tattooed on her shoulder in Chinese characters. Back in Hong Kong, Robert had suspected that Nancy was cheating on him, so he hired a private investigator in the United States to follow Nancy around. Robert had told the investigator that he feared his wife would leave him and take their children away from him. This investigator uncovered evidence of her relationship with Michael, but he was unable to get photos or videos of the lovers together. By the end of the summer, the SARS epidemic had abated, and Nancy returned to Hong Kong with her children. She however stayed in touch with Michael, calling him frequently. Though she loved Michael a lot, she had never considered getting divorced from Robert. She said that her lover was just a temporary shelter from her stormy marriage. Nancy claimed that as soon as she returned to Hong Kong, Robert became increasingly violent and erratic, throwing temper tantrums over relatively insignificant matters, such as not finding any orange juice in the fridge and then flying into a rage. In late August, she flew back to New York with Robert so that he could have back surgery. Robert decided that he would once again hire the same investigator again to spy on Nancy while they were there. On the day of Rob's surgery, Nancy did not even wait for Rob to get out of theatre. She left the hospital and went to a hotel to meet her lover. After his surgery, Rob phoned the investigator wanting to find out what he found on Nancy whilst he was in the hospital, and when he was told about this, he merely said, "It should be fine. As long as I can keep her away from the United States, we should be able to make it work." After Rob had recovered, the couple returned to Hong Kong, and Nancy started fearing that Robert might be suspicious and he might be thinking that she was doing something. Nancy ordered a new cell phone for herself and had the bill sent to the Hong Kong International School where she volunteered. This way, she felt that she could keep up her communication with Michael without Robert knowing. What she didn't know was that her husband had hired private investigators in Hong Kong to install spyware programs on the family's computers in order to monitor her email and internet use. The private investigator that Rob hired to spy on Nancy received a call from Rob when the couple had returned to Hong Kong. Allegedly, Robert was quite upset because he believed his wife was poisoning his single malt scotch. Robert had told the investigator that recently his favorite drink didn't taste right and the effects of drinking it were quite remarkable, making him feel woozy and disoriented most times. He advised Rob to have a sample of the scotch analyzed and to have himself tested for traces of poison. But Rob stated that he felt guilty about his suspicions and didn't feel like Nancy would actually do something like that. And he never ended up taking the investigator's advice. On the afternoon of Sunday, November 2nd, 2003, Andrew Tanzer brought his 7-year-old daughter to the Kissels apartment for a playdate. Tanzer and his family also lived in the same apartment complex, and their daughters had become friends at school. He chatted with Robert Kissel while the daughters played. After about 45 minutes of the visit, Tanzer said that he had to go and asked if he could have a glass of water before he left. Instead of water, his daughter and the Kissels' oldest daughter brought out 2 glasses filled with a homemade milkshake. The girls offered 1 glass to Tanzer and the other to Kissel. The milkshake had been reddish in color, and he thought that it was probably from strawberry flavoring. It was fairly heavy, sweet, thickened, and tasted of bananas and crushed cookies. Nancy popped her head out of the kitchen and told Tanzer that it was a secret recipe and that the color was in the spirit of Halloween, which had just passed. Like many of the expat mothers in Hong Kong, Nancy went out of her way to celebrate American holidays. Every fall, she even arranged to have a shipment of pumpkins flown in for the Hong Kong International School. Tanzer had been in a hurry to leave, so he drained his glass of milkshake, and Robert followed by doing the same, so he could show Tanzer out. When Andrew returned to his apartment, his wife noticed that his face was unusually red. He told her that he was extremely tired and fell into a deep sleep on the sofa. Worried that he wasn't well, she tried to wake him, but even shouting in his face and slapping his cheeks didn't rouse him. Later on, a ringing telephone finally woke him from his slumber. He dozed on and off until dinner time, but by his own description, he behaved like a temperamental baby. After eating dinner, he said that he devoured his ice cream dessert, but that did not satisfy him, and he went to the kitchen for more. For some reason, he was insatiable and wanted to eat as much sweets as possible. and he ended up devouring 3 full cartons of ice cream. Afterwards, again like a baby, unable to control himself, he swirled the furniture. The next morning, when he awoke, he remembered almost nothing that his wife had told him had happened after he returned from the Kissels' apartment. He felt almost like he had amnesia. Rob, on the other hand, did not show up to work for the next few days. His office tried to contact Robert with no success. A friend of Rob's had called several Hong Kong hotels looking for him because there had been mentions that he and Nancy had been having marital problems, so it was possible that he might have moved out of the apartment for a while. But this friend had been unable to locate Rob and told another friend, David No, who was the vice president of the Hong Kong office of Merrill Lynch, about this. He was also a close friend with Robert's. He then contacted Nancy and asked about Rob and his whereabouts. Nancy told David that Rob had been dealing with some personal issues and would not be coming to the office for quite a while. David immediately felt as if Nancy had been lying. Rob had always been very professional and would never just stay away from work, and would have informed someone if that was the case. This is when he decided to call the police and tell them that Robert had not been seen or heard from in 4 days. Robert was a prominent member of the American expat community in Hong Kong, and the report of his disappearance triggered an all-out search for him. Within hours of David's call on 6 November, police investigators went to his Parkview apartment to interview Nancy. They questioned her about her husband's whereabouts. They also asked her about a police report that she had filed that morning, in which she stated that her husband had assaulted her over the previous weekend on the 2nd of November after they had a fight. She told the police that she had no idea where Robert was, and that he had left the apartment after their fight and he never returned. The police looked through the apartment and there were no obvious signs of a struggle visible, but they had felt that something was off. Nancy also didn't seem too worried about her husband that had gone missing. That same evening, the police interviewed maintenance men at the apartment complex, wanting to find out whether they had seen or heard anything, which is when they learned that Nancy had called the management office the day before to have a rug moved to her storeroom. The workers told the police that the rug had been unusually heavy and that it had taken 4 of them to move it. They also told police that the rug had smelled really bad, and Nancy ignored them when they reported the smell to her. After receiving this information, the police immediately requested a search warrant to enter the Kissel storeroom. It was almost midnight on 6 November 2003 when Hong Kong police investigators entered the Kissel storage room in the Parkview estate, and they almost immediately found what they were looking for behind the door. Hidden beneath a bag filled with bed sheets, old clothing, and some pillows, there was a rolled up oriental rug tied with rope and bound with clear adhesive tape. The rug seemed suspiciously bulky, and when the investigators unrolled it, they found exactly what they thought they might: a decaying body. Robert's body had been sealed tight in plastic wrap. His head had been covered with a black plastic bag. His entire body had also been placed inside a large white plastic bag and bound with red adhesive tape, and then rolled into the rug. The investigators knew instantly, after removing the wrapping, that Robert had been dead for some time. The smell of decay was just too powerful for this to have been a recent death. After finding Robert's body, police arrested Nancy at their apartment at 2:41 a.m. on Friday morning, November 7, 2003. Police pathologists were dispatched to examine Robert's body and determined that he had been struck 5 times in the head with a blunt instrument. Tests were also later done on him, revealed the presence of 6 prescription medications in his bloodstream. Upon more investigation, they found that at least 5 of these were medications prescribed to Nancy, including the date rape drug Rohypnol, the painkiller dextropropoxetine, the sedative Lorivan, the antidepressant amitriptyline, and the sleeping pill Stilnox. That was a mouthful. When interviewing neighbors, Tanzer told them about his experience at the Kissel house and the strange reddish-pink milkshakes that Nancy had served them, as well as the after effects that he had suffered. They had enough evidence to implicate Nancy, and she was charged with the murder of her husband. Every time I look at this case, I just think about that Khalees song, na 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 na. But Nancy's would be, her milkshake brings all the boys to the grave. Anyone else think of that? Nope. Just me? Okay then, let's move on. Nancy's arrest and trial sent shockwaves through Hong Kong's expat community. The Kissels were what had been seen as your typical expat couple. Robert coped with his high-paying, high-pressure job by whatever means necessary, while Nancy maintained a luxurious household complete with servants and a nanny. Nancy was a familiar face in the community because of her volunteer work, and she was well known among other Hong Kong expat moms. Perhaps the thing that rattled the expats most was how similar the Kissels were to them. Many of them shared the same marital problems and struggles that the Kissels had. Lots of money, too much stress, never enough time together, or not enough will to care. The biggest difference was that Nancy acted on her frustrations, while the others had remained suffering in silence. Many of these expats condemned Nancy from the start, but several of her friends ignored the eyebrows that were raised and the tongues that were clucked and ran to Nancy's aid. Some of them had even offered to raise money for Nancy's defense. For those native to Hong Kong, the Kissel case gave them a rare glimpse into the world of the rich foreigners that came to stay in their country. They followed the trial closely with a mix of fascination, horror, and disapproval, but they always wanted to know more. The tabloids were filled with stories and updates from the trial. Because of Robert's status in the business community, journalists from business publications and news wires also reported on the trial. The court was fully packed with spectators every day, almost all of them from the expat community, eager to see what would happen next and what gossip they would have to talk about at their next tennis game or fundraising event. Every day, a pale and gaunt-looking Nancy appeared in court, wearing almost the same outfit every day. Always something black, like a black dress or black shirt with a black skirt or black pants, and oval metal rimmed glasses, with her dark hair hanging loose. More than likely a strategy that her lawyers came up with to make her seem like your average person that doesn't wear designer clothes and whose husband didn't earn around $3 million a year in bonuses alone. You know, she should need some sympathy. Constantly by Nancy's side was her mother, their fingers more often than not interlaced in a tight grip. By the end of July 2005, the prosecution had presented its case portraying Nancy as the cheating wife who meticulously planned the murder of her husband so that she could run off with her lover. Though there were no eyewitnesses to the crime, the circumstantial evidence presented was overwhelming. The same prescription drugs that she had obtained from doctors for herself were found in her dead husband's bloodstream. Andrew Tanzer, the family friend who shared that pink milkshake with the victim, testified to feeling nearly comatose and acting bizarrely after consuming Nancy's, as she called it, secret recipe. Maintenance men at her apartment complex testified that she had ordered them to move the rug containing Robert Kissel's body to a storage room, and when they reported the smell, she ignored them. Bloody clothes and linens found in the storage room and in the apartment indicated that Robert withstood a brutal beating from a heavy blunt object, and that the beating had happened on the couple's bed, not on the floor as Nancy had described it. The prosecution claimed that the murder weapon was a heavy figurine that the Kissels had kept in their kitchen. Nancy could have pleaded insanity in the murder of her husband, but that would have guaranteed her indefinite incarceration in a psychiatric facility, which she did not want. Instead, she and her barrister chose to plead something else: diminished responsibility. The legal system in Hong Kong allows for defendants to plead guilty to a crime committed under extraordinary circumstances as diminished responsibility that would reduce the defendant's culpability. But this was a risky move. By entering this plea, the burden of proof shifts from the prosecution to the defense. The only thing the prosecution would then have to do is poke holes in Nancy's version of events, and they would win the case. On the 1st of August 2005, Nancy took the stand and presented her case to the court. Nancy's heart-rending testimony took up the first 10 days of the trial. She presented a very different image of her husband than what the expat community had seen and known. To them, Robert Kissel was successful, respected, and admired. But to his wife, he was a drug addict and a brutal control freak who beat her regularly and forced her to have rough sex with him almost every night. She described the hell that her marriage had become over the years, telling the court that behind closed doors he was a monster and that he drove her to commit murder. She told them how and when he started using coke, and that they would argue about it, and she would vehemently protest that he was wasting her hard-earned money on drugs. She also told them about how their troubles got worse after the birth of their first child, when he body shamed her and started forcing her to have sex with him in ways that she was not comfortable with. She said he started treating her rougher, and if she resisted, he hurt her. She said that this treatment of her became more and more frequent, and she soon learned to accept his unwanted penetration, because when she resisted, the result would be anal bleeding. She said that on one occasion, he was so aggressive she heard something pop in her torso, and after she went to the hospital, she learned that he had broken one of her ribs. She also claimed that his high-pressure job and the transfer to Hong Kong just made things worse between the two of them, which is when they had the fight about the date of their son's birth, and he hit her for the first time. She described her first attempt to ask Robert for a divorce after seeing a marriage counselor. She said he shouted at her, "I'm the one who makes the money. If there's a divorce, you don't ask for it. I ask for it." She went on to explain that she wasn't the only target of his rages, and that sometimes he even overreacted with children, blowing up over relatively minor things, and that on one occasion her younger daughter had been playing on the bed loudly whilst her husband was trying to have a telephone conversation. This is when Robert allegedly lost his patience and yanked her off of the bed by her arm and broke it. She said that the SARS epidemic came as a blessing for her and got her away from her husband's physical tyranny. Though he continued to keep close tabs on her spending, at least she did not suffer physically. She told them about meeting Michael, and at first that they were just friends, and she felt as if she finally found someone that she could really talk to. They enjoyed each other's company and became lovers, and they were intimate, but at no time did she ever consider leaving her marriage. She stated that she knew her life was in Hong Kong with her husband and her children. Nancy testified that she was having trouble sleeping when she returned to Hong Kong because of the increased turmoil in her life. She then started thinking also about taking her own life and searched the internet for medications that would kill her but make it seem like she had a heart attack, so that her children wouldn't know that she had taken her own life. Based on this research, she then went to several doctors complaining of symptoms that would get her the medications that she had been wanting. According to Nancy, on October 23, 2003, she and her husband had another bitter argument about divorce, and he lost his temper again. He then beat her and forced himself on her. The incident had left her distraught, and she went to see a pediatrician, complaining that she was so worried about her husband's behavior, she was afraid to fall asleep at night. This doctor gave her a prescription for other stronger sleeping pills. By October 23, she had stockpiled 10 tablets of Rohypnol and 20 tablets of the painkiller dextropropoxetine, as well as prescriptions for a sedative, an antidepressant, and some sleeping medications. On the morning of 2nd November 2003, the Kissel family attended services at the synagogue. That afternoon she said that she made pink milkshakes for the children, and that while she was in the kitchen busy making these milkshakes, her husband then stood in the hallway and announced that he had filed for divorce and was taking the children. He told her that she wasn't fit to care for them. She said that he was holding a baseball bat and started tossing it from one hand to the other. He told her that he had it with him to protect himself from her. She says he then walked down the hallway towards the master bedroom and she followed him, demanding answers. She said that she was carrying a heavy figurine with her that they had kept in the kitchen. Whilst they were in the hallway, she pointed her finger in his face, saying, "What do you mean you filed for divorce?" She said he slapped her hand away twice, but she kept pointing it at him, a habit of hers that he allegedly detested. After the second time she did that, he snatched her hand and held onto it. He kept it in a tight grip and she struggled to break free, which is when she spat in his face, and he retaliated by striking her across the mouth so hard that she fell down and dropped the figurine. She said that he then pulled her into the room, threw her onto the bed and forced himself on her again. She tried to fight him off by kicking him, and they ended up wrestling and ended up on the floor. She tried to crawl away, but that he grabbed her by the ankle, which is when he told her, "I'm not finished with you yet," and he wouldn't let her go. She then reached for the statue and swung back. She said that she didn't even look, but she had felt she had hit something. When she looked back, she saw her husband sitting on the floor, bleeding from the head. She said that she tried to help him, but that he wouldn't let her. He dragged himself up onto the bed and sat there looking at her, stunned, which was when he touched his head and realized that he was bleeding. As soon as he realized this, he became enraged and he picked up the bat that was on the floor and swung at her, hitting her leg and knee. She said that she held the statue up to her face for protection, and she felt the bat hitting the metal, stinging her hands. She became upset when questioned further and claimed that she couldn't remember much else of the incident. She claimed that she had no other recollection of what happened or much of the days that followed. She said that she vaguely recalled driving in her car the next day, but couldn't remember buying the rug that was used to put her husband's body in. Nor could she remember cleaning up the bedroom or arranging for the removal of the rug. She said that at the time, it didn't even sink in that her husband was dead. She said that her memory of those days came back in little pieces around 6 months after the events, while she was incarcerated at the Sulam Psychiatric Center. Cross-examination of Nancy began with 2 simple questions. "Do you accept that you killed Robert Kissel?" "Yes," she answered. "Did you further cause the injuries on Robert Kissel with the metallic ornament?" Again, she replied yes. Nancy continued insisting that her memory of the events surrounding her husband's death remained patchy, and that she had repressed them for months, even though she had no history of memory loss. When she was asked whether she ever told anyone about her husband's assaults on her, she said no, it's not just something you talk about to the girls. When asked if she had ever undergone any physical exams in relation to the forceful penetrations that she mentioned, she also said no, that it was humiliating. When asked whether she had sent her daughter to deliver the tainted milkshake to her husband, she adamantly denied involving her daughter, stating that the children were out of the house when the fatal argument began. On the allegations that Rob broke his daughter's arm because she was making too much noise, the housekeeper had testified that the little girl had broken her arm whilst playing with her older sister. Nancy stated that their house was in chaos that day, so they might have seen things differently. When the defense suggested that Nancy Kissel was simply trying to smear her husband's name, she became visibly upset, saying that as much as her husband's behavior scared her, she felt helpless to do anything about it. She stated that if it weren't for those things, she would still be with him. With tears streaming down her face, she said, "I still love him deeply." She admitted that while Rob was in the operating room, that she had met her lover, but that they had gone to Central Park for an hour and a half, not to a hotel. Her phone records also showed that she had made 52 phone calls to Michael in September 2003 and 106 in October of that year. On the day that she had obtained the prescription for the potent Rohypnol, she had called him 7 times. It was also shown that she had called Michael at 7:41 a.m. on the morning after her husband's death and spoke to him for 24 minutes. When she was asked what they discussed, she responded to this question by saying that they had discussed many issues during that conversation. Phone records showed that on November 4, 2003, Nancy called Michael 6 times. This was the day that she went to a doctor and complained of total body pain, although she never mentioned anything to the doctor about sodomy or a baseball bat, although other witnesses testified that she did show them the bruising on her knee and her leg. A doctor later testified that Nancy's pain reactions were disproportionate to the actual injuries that she had found on her. CCTV footage was also presented in court that showed Nancy on the morning after the alleged beating carrying a suitcase, shopping bags, and the rug that she had used to wrap her husband's body in. Finally, she was asked about her version of the physical confrontation with her husband on Sunday, November 2, 2003, and asked how she had managed to defend herself with the metal figurine. "I don't know," she replied. The lawyer said, "Because it didn't happen, Mrs. Kissel. It just didn't happen." Which is when she cried out, "He was going to kill me. He was going to kill me. Oh God, he was going to kill me." And that was when the defense rested their cross-examination of Nancy. After Nancy was finished with her cross-exam, the defense called a series of character witnesses who portrayed Nancy Kissel as a dedicated mother, an active volunteer at her children's school, and a troubled wife in a deteriorating marriage. One friend testified that she had seen Kissel with a black eye in late October 2003, but assumed that it was the result of a bump with a child. Later, the head music teacher at the Hong Kong International School was asked if she had ever noticed Nancy having a black eye. This witness said that she'd never seen any injuries on Kissel's face, but added that she habitually wore blue or yellow tinted glasses indoor, which the teacher attributed to Kissel's artistic personality. They also put forth evidence found on the family's computer, which showed that Robert had been searching and perusing internet sites portraying gay and deviant sexual behavior. This would add to Nancy's claims of how he behaved sexually. Prosecution was allowed at this time to revisit the wooden baseball bat, which Nancy claimed her husband had used on her the day that he died. A forensic expert testified that after conducting extensive tests on the bat, he concluded that the metal statue she said that she used to defend herself was not struck repeatedly by the bat as she had claimed, because the bat showed no signs of paint smears from the painted statue. The statue also showed no wood grain patterns as a result of having been struck. Summations began in late August 2005. Prosecutors told the court this was a cold-blooded murder. Instead of the life or death struggle with a madman that Nancy Kissel had depicted, she had used the metal figurine to inflict the injuries on her husband Robert Kissel as he was laying down on the bed, helpless or even unconscious as a result of drinking the potent milkshake that she had given him. Her motive was to remove the obstacle in her life that Robert Kissel had become, so that she could make room for her lover. She then left him in the bedroom, not knowing what to do, and made plans on how to clean up and get rid of the body. In their summation, the defense maintained that Nancy killed her husband in self-defense, in a struggle that began when he announced that he was filing for divorce and taking the children away from her. They also claimed that police overlooked bloodstains in the apartment that would have proven that a struggle had taken place. The defense characterized Robert as brutal and unpleasant. They also stated that the 5 blows to Robert Kissel's head were Nancy's frantic attempts to subdue him before he hurt her. After hearing the summations, the judge instructed the jury to consider the possibility that Nancy Kissel had in fact killed her husband in self-defense without premeditation. He also asked them to keep in mind that Robert Kissel was well built and that the defendant is a relatively slightly built female. The jury deliberated for only 8 hours before returning to the crowded courtroom on September 1, 2005, and the jury foreman read their unanimous decision. Nancy Kissel was guilty of murder. Nancy Kissel, dressed in black as she had been throughout her trial, showed no emotion as the verdict was read. Under Hong Kong law, the mandatory penalty for murder is life imprisonment. Kissel was sent to serve her sentence in the Tai Lam Institute for Women.
And justice has been done. Nancy has been declared guilty in a half a day by the entire jury. And I pray that Robert, the allegations made against Robert, the false allegations made against him, will now be forgotten, and Robert can rest in peace, and his children can now go on with their lives and have a wonderful life ahead, knowing that all these terrible things are untrue. And Robert was a beautiful, beautiful man and a beautiful, beautiful father. And he tried to be a good husband, but I'm glad it's over and justice has been done.
After Robert's murder, the 3 Kissel children were sent to the United States to live with Nancy's father, Ira Kishan, and his wife in Winnetka, Illinois. But the couple found it difficult caring for 3 young children, which is when plans were made for the kids to live with Nancy's half-brother Brooks, who was at the time an unmarried medical student. Bill Kissel, Robert's father, was not going to allow this to happen with his grandchildren. This is when Robert's brother Andrew Kissel, who lived in Greenwich, Connecticut, petitioned the court for guardianship of his nephew and 2 nieces. He and his wife Haley were already parents to 2 children of their own, and he argued that his household would be a more appropriate environment for his brother's children, promising to give them a stable, loving home. The court granted him and his wife temporary custody against the apparent wishes of Nancy. She wrote a notarized declaration whilst awaiting trial, which stated, "In no event shall my 3 children be placed under the care, direction, or supervision of Andrew Kissel." But she didn't really have much choice, or a say in the matter, since she later became a convicted murderer. In July 2005, during the same time that Nancy's trial had started, Andrew Kissel was also hit with legal problems of his own, and he was charged with extensive real estate fraud after an FBI investigation was led regarding his investments and finances. At the same time, his wife Haley filed for divorce. Andrew would, however, never make it to trial. In April 2006, he was found murdered in the basement of his Greenwich home, stabbed 5 times with his hands and feet bound with cable ties. For a while after his death, Haley continued on with the guardianship of the Kissel children. But later, the guardianship was turned over to Robert's sister Jane Kissel Clayton, with whom the children continued to reside in Washington state. In 2011, Andrew's chauffeur and his cousin were incarcerated for Andrew's murder. Nancy appealed the guilty verdict soon after her conviction, citing procedural errors in the trial. But on October 6, 2008, after nearly 5 months of deliberation, the Hong Kong Court of Appeal upheld the original verdict.
I'm disappointed that we didn't get more support from these 3 justices to pursue a fair judgment.
In February 2010, Nancy again pleaded her case before the Court of Final Appeal. They were to preside and decide on numerous elements of grave concern according to Nancy's team. When they reviewed Nancy's case to decide if Nancy Kissel had received a fair trial, the court unanimously allowed the appeal, thus quashing Nancy's original conviction, and they then ordered a retrial on 11 June 2010. Nancy was awarded half her trial expenses from the first trial.
I think justice has been served. I'm proud. I'm very proud of Nancy. She was a good wife. She is a great mother, a great daughter, a great sister, and a great friend. She's elated. She's elated. And she's very, very happy, and very, very happy for your support too.
We didn't see her parents.
Very, very pleased with the outcome, and she's been given an opportunity for justice to be served properly. So we're pleased to see that for her.
Nancy's retrial started on 10 January 2011, and on 25 March 2011, Nancy was again found guilty of first-degree murder and resentenced to life imprisonment. In 2014, she did her first interview. She was asked whether she had regretted what she had done, on which she answered, "I asked for forgiveness and repent. That's very different from regret." To this day, she still maintains that it's hard for her to say what happened that night. "I can't spend my time explaining the unexplainable. I'd rather try to seek a peaceful heart. I don't know how to undo something I've never understood," she said. During this interview, she also stated that she does not have a relationship with her children. She said, "My children are in Seattle and they need to heal from something they won't ever understand." Nancy has since sought to have the Long-Term Prison Sentences Review Board convert her sentence to a definite term, but it was turned down in 2016. This prompted her to seek a judicial review of that decision. But the matter has also been twice dismissed by different courts. Nancy has petitioned the Court of Appeal for early release, but in 2020 they refused to grant leave to Nancy. As of 2022, Nancy Kissel is 58 years old. She still remains incarcerated at Tai Lam's Institute for Women, and all attempts at reducing her sentence has been denied. So that is it for today's case. Please let me know what you think. What's your opinion on the matter? What do you think about the milkshake murderess? Thank you so much again for clicking on this video. Please remember to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't done so yet. I really do appreciate you if you made it this far. Until next time, bye!